October 14th, 1943. Thorpe Abbotts Airfield, England. The pre-dawn darkness hung thick over the 100th Bomb Group's base, broken only by the dim glow of flashlights bobbing between Nissen huts. At 0400 hours, the CQ runner moved from barracks to barracks, shaking men awake with the same terse announcement. Briefing at 0500, full combat load. Lieutenant Robert Rosenthal rolled out of his bunk in Hut 7, his breath visible in the October cold. Around him, 9 other pilots stirred, some silent, others muttering curses into the darkness. They'd flown yesterday, and the day before that. The grinding mathematics of the air war over Europe allowed no rest. In the mess hall, the usual banter was absent. Men pushed powdered eggs around metal trays, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt oil, their eyes distant. They knew the routine too well now. Early wake-up meant a deep penetration mission, far into Germany, beyond the range of friendly fighters. Staff Sergeant Lewis Johnson, a ball turret gunner with the 351st Bomb Squadron, sat with his crew at a corner table. His hand trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette, the third since waking. He was 19 years old. This would be his 8th mission. He needed 17 more to complete his tour and go home. The briefing room filled with cigarette smoke and nervous tension as crews filed in, their leather jackets creaking, boots scraping against concrete. Major John Bucky Egan stood at the front, his jaw set, waiting for the room to settle. Behind him hung a large map of Europe, covered by a white sheet. When the murmuring died down, he pulled the sheet away in one swift motion. A collective groan rolled through the room like a physical wave. A red string stretched from England, across the Channel, deep into Germany, ending at a small dot labelled Schweinfurt. "Gentlemen," Major Egan's voice cut through the protests, "I know what you're thinking. Yes, we hit Schweinfurt in August. Yes, we lost 60 birds. But intelligence says Jerry moved his ball bearing production back into those factories. Without ball bearings, their tanks don't roll, their planes don't fly. This is the target that can shorten the war." He paused, letting his words sink in. 291 B-17s will participate in this strike. The 1st Bomb Division will lead, followed by the 3rd Division. We'll have P-47 escort until they hit their fuel limit, approximately the German border. Another pause, heavier than the first. After that, you're on your own until you reach the target and complete the bomb run. The intelligence officer stepped forward, pointer in hand. Enemy fighter concentrations are estimated at 300 to 400 aircraft, Me-109s, FW-190s, and twin-engine destroyers. Flak over the target will be intense and accurate. The Germans know we're coming. They've had 2 months to reinforce their defenses since August. He tapped the map at various points along the route. Expect initial contact here, at the German frontier. Heavy resistance here, over Frankfurt, and concentrated attacks during your bomb run and withdrawal. Captain John Lucky Luckadoo of the 100th sat in the 3rd row, his notebook open, mechanically writing down altitudes, airspeeds, rally points. But his mind was calculating different numbers. August's raid, 60 bombers lost. That was 26%. If today's losses matched that rate, 76 crews wouldn't come home. 760 men. He looked around the room at familiar faces. Williams, who owed him $5 from last night's poker game. Martinez, who'd shown him photographs of his newborn daughter just yesterday. Harriman, the co-pilot who'd saved their aircraft 2 weeks ago when the pilot was wounded. In his mind, Luckadoo began erasing faces, playing the morbid mathematics of survival. The chaplain stood to offer a prayer. Some men bowed their heads, others stared straight ahead, their minds already in the sky, already over Germany, already fighting. Lord, watch over these men as they venture into harm's way. Bring them home safely to fight another day. Give them courage, steady their hands, and guide them through the valley of the shadow of death. Amen. The response was a scattered murmur. Faith seemed a fragile thing when measured against 20mm cannon shells and 88mm flak. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, a weak grey dawn that promised nothing. Ground crews had worked through the night, loading 4,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs into each aircraft, filling fuel tanks to capacity, loading ammunition belts for 13.50 caliber machine guns per plane. The B-17s sat in their hardstands like great sleeping beasts, dew collecting on their aluminum skin. Names were painted on their noses: Memphis Belle, Made in America, 909, Murder Inc. Each name represented a crew's hope, their identity, their defiance against the odds. Rosenthal walked to his aircraft, Rosie's riveters, with his crew trailing behind. His co-pilot, Lieutenant MacDonald, fell in step beside him. "Hell of a target," MacDonald said quietly. Rosenthal nodded, saying nothing. What was there to say? They'd known since August what Schweinfurt meant. The intelligence photographs showed the factories, the rail yards, the critical infrastructure. They also showed the ring of flak towers surrounding the city, the fighter bases nearby, the clear approaches that gave German defenders every advantage. This was going to be a slaughter, and everyone knew it. The pre-flight checks began in silence, broken only by technical call-outs. Staff Sergeant Henry Red Bowley, the flight engineer aboard Rosie's riveters, moved through his inspection with methodical precision. He ran his hands along the leading edge of the wing, checking for stress fractures or battle damage from their last mission that maintenance might have missed. Each of the 4 Wright R1820 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, received his personal attention. Oil levels, fuel lines, magnetos, spark plugs, propeller pitch mechanisms. A single mechanical failure at 25,000 feet over Germany meant a choice between crash landing in enemy territory or ditching in the North Sea. Neither option offered good odds. In the ball turret beneath the aircraft's belly, Sergeant Johnson squeezed himself into the cramped glass sphere, testing the traverse mechanism. The ball turret was a marvel of engineering and a nightmare of claustrophobia. A plexiglass sphere barely 4 feet in diameter, housing 2 .50 caliber machine guns and 1 very small man. Johnson was 5'4" and weighed 130 pounds, selected for this position precisely because larger men simply didn't fit. Once the aircraft was airborne and he rotated into position, he would remain curled in a fetal position for the next 8 to 10 hours, unable to wear a parachute, unable to reach the rest of the crew, suspended beneath the aircraft with nothing between him and the earth but glass and 25,000 feet of empty air. Radio operator, Technical Sergeant Frank Murphy, climbed through the fuselage checking his equipment. The radio room, located just behind the bomb bay, was his domain, a cramped space filled with vacuum tubes, dials, and frequency crystals. He would monitor command frequencies, relay position reports, call out fighter attacks, and, if things went badly, send distress signals. His training included Morse code, radio procedure, and the grim task of recording crew casualties for the official report. In a canvas bag beside his station, he kept morphine syrettes, sulfur powder, and compression bandages. On long missions deep into Germany, radio operators often became medics. The waist gunners, Sergeants Paul Swank and Charlie Crickshank, loaded ammunition belts into their .50 caliber machine guns. Each belt contained a mix of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds in a carefully calculated pattern. The tracers allowed gunners to observe their shots, but they also revealed the gunner's position to enemy fighters. It was a trade-off that had been debated since the first air combat over France in 1918. Along the aluminum skin of the fuselage, they could still see patches where flak damage from last week's mission had been repaired. Thin aluminum riveted over holes, some as large as a man's fist. The patches were a different shade than the original metal, creating a patchwork pattern that told the aircraft's combat history. The waist gunners, Sergeants Paul Swank and Charlie Crickshank, loaded ammunition belts into their .50 caliber machine guns. Each belt contained a mix of armor-piercing, incendiary and tracer rounds in a carefully calculated pattern. The tracers allowed gunners to observe their shots, but they also revealed the gunner's position to enemy fighters. It was a trade-off that had been debated since the first air combat over France in 1918. Along the aluminum skin of the fuselage, they could still see patches where flak damage from last week's mission had been repaired. Thin aluminum riveted over holes, some as large as a man's fist. The patches were a different shade than the original metal, creating a patchwork pattern that told the aircraft's combat history. Tail gunner Staff Sergeant George Moffat climbed into his isolated position at the very rear of the aircraft. The tail gun position was considered the loneliest spot on a B-17. Separated from the crew by the entire length of the fuselage, exposed to the coldest temperatures, and the primary target for German fighters attacking from the rear. Moffat arranged his ammunition cans, tested his intercom connection, and positioned his relief tube, a rubber hose attached to a funnel that vented outside the aircraft. On missions lasting 8 to 10 hours at 25,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to 50 degrees below zero, even basic biological functions became complicated engineering problems. At 6:30 hours, green flares arced into the morning sky from the control tower, the first signal to start engines. Across Thorpe Abbotts and a dozen other airfields scattered across East Anglia, nearly 3,000 men reached for engine primers. Rosenthal's hand moved to the number 3 engine, the outboard engine on the right wing. Standard procedure was to start the inboard engines first, then work outward. "Clear 3!" he shouted out the cockpit window. The ground crew chief, standing beside the propeller, raised his hand in acknowledgement and shouted back, "Clear 3!" Rosenthal engaged a starter. The propeller blades began to turn slowly, reluctantly, the engine coughing and sputtering. Black smoke belched from the exhaust stacks. Then, with a roar that could be felt in the chest, the engine caught, the propeller becoming a blur, the entire aircraft shuddering with contained power. One by one, the other 3 engines thundered to life. The noise was immense, overwhelming. 4 9-cylinder radial engines producing 4,800 combined horsepower, their sound multiplying as other aircraft across the field started their engines. The very air seemed to vibrate. Inside the aircraft, the noise level jumped from conversation to shouting. The intercom became the only way to communicate. MacDonald checked the instruments. Oil pressure climbing into the green, cylinder head temperatures rising, fuel flow steady, manifold pressure normal. Behind them, the bomb bay doors remained open, revealing 8 500-pound general-purpose bombs nestled in their racks. Each bomb bore stenciled instructions, nose fuse and tail fuse, along with chalked messages from the ordnance crews, Hitler's Easter egg and return to sender, postage paid. At 700 hours, the second flare burst over the control tower, red this time. Time to taxi. Lead aircraft began moving first, following the perimeter track toward the runway. Rosie's riveters fell into line, the entire aircraft lurching and swaying as it rolled across the grass. The tail wheel, small and far behind the center of gravity, made ground handling difficult. Pilots had to apply differential brake pressure and asymmetric engine power to keep the aircraft tracking straight. Through the cockpit windows, Rosenthal could see other B-17s converging from their hardstands, a migration of aluminum and rivets toward the runway threshold. The tower controller's voice crackled over the radio. "All aircraft, wind is 270 at 10 knots. Altimeter 2992. Runway 25 cleared for takeoff. Good hunting, gentlemen." There was a pause, then he added quietly, almost as an afterthought, "God be with you." Rosenthal and MacDonald exchanged a glance. Tower controllers were usually all business, strictly professional, emotionally detached. That quiet prayer meant the controller knew what this mission represented. Everyone knew. The lead aircraft reached the runway, turned into position, and ran up its engines. Even from 50 yards away, Rosenthal could feel the power. 4 engines at full throttle, 60,000 pounds of bomber, fuel, bombs, and men straining against the brakes. Then the brakes released, and the B-17 began rolling, slowly at first, then gathering speed, the tail wheel lifting off the ground, the main gear taking all the weight, the propellers clawing at the air. At 110 miles per hour, the bomber lifted off, climbing away into the grey English morning. 30 seconds later, the second aircraft began its takeoff roll, then the third. The interval between takeoffs was carefully timed to avoid propeller wash and allow aircraft to form up in the sky. Rosie's riveters reached the runway threshold at 0742 hours. Rosenthal locked the tailwheel straight, aligned the aircraft with the center line, and pushed all 4 throttles forward to the stops. The engines responded with a thundering roar that drowned out thought itself. The bomber began accelerating down the runway, every rivet and panel rattling, the control yoke shaking in Rosenthal's hands. MacDonald called out airspeeds: 60 knots, 70, 80. At 60,000 pounds gross weight, twice the aircraft's empty weight, the takeoff roll seemed to last forever. The runway's end markers approached with alarming speed. 90 knots, 100. The tail wheel lifted off the concrete, and suddenly Rosenthal had better control, the rudder pedals becoming effective in the propeller wash. 110, 115. He eased back on the yoke. For a moment nothing happened, the bomber clinging to earth, rolling on its main gear, reluctant to fly. Then, almost imperceptibly, the rumbling stopped. They were airborne. "Gear up," Rosenthal ordered. MacDonald reached for the landing gear lever. Hydraulic pumps whined as the main wheels retracted into the engine nacelles and wing roots. The airspeed increased immediately. The wheels had been creating enormous drag. Rosenthal banked left, climbing at 150 miles per hour, following the lead aircraft already circling at 5,000 feet. The assembly process was a carefully choreographed aerial ballet involving nearly 300 aircraft, each trying to find its assigned position in the formation without colliding with others in the cloudy English sky. Each bomb group fired distinctive colored flares to identify themselves. The 100th bomb group used red-red-green. Squadron leaders orbited specific radio beacons, their aircraft marked with brightly painted tails or checkerboard patterns to make them visible through the haze and engine exhaust. It took 90 minutes to assemble the entire strike force. During that time, Rosie's riveters circled endlessly over East Anglia, gradually climbing, tucking into position in the high squadron of the lead group. The formation doctrine was specific and inflexible. Aircraft flew in tight groups of 3 called Vics. 4 Vics made a squadron. 3 squadrons made a group. The entire formation resembled a massive 3-dimensional arrowhead pointed at Germany, with each aircraft positioned to provide mutual defensive fire against attacking fighters. In theory, the overlapping fields of fire from 39.50 caliber machine guns per group would create an impenetrable shield of lead. In practice, German fighters had learned to exploit the formation's weak points. At 9:15 hours, the assembly was complete. The entire armada, 291 B-17 flying fortresses carrying 2,900 men and 1,164,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs, turned southeast toward the English Channel. Below, the patchwork of English farmland slipped away, replaced by the grey-green waters of the North Sea. Rosenthal trimmed the aircraft for level flight at 12,000 feet, adjusting throttle settings to maintain position on the lead aircraft's left wing. Flying formation required constant attention, tiny adjustments to power, pitch, and bank to maintain the precise spacing that defensive doctrine demanded. A gap in the formation was an invitation for German fighters to attack. Over the intercom, Rosenthal ordered oxygen checks. At 12,000 feet, supplemental oxygen became mandatory. Each crew member tested his oxygen mask, checking for leaks, adjusting the flow rate, verifying that the green indicator ball in the flow meter bobbed with each breath. Oxygen system failure was a death sentence. At 25,000 feet, their planned bombing altitude, a man would lose consciousness in 3 to 5 minutes without oxygen. In the ball turret, Sergeant Johnson rotated his position to test the oxygen hose connections, ensuring they wouldn't snag or disconnect during combat maneuvers. The gunners test-fired their weapons over the channel, short bursts to ensure the guns functioned and to clear any ice from the barrels. The sound was like ripping canvas, magnified 1,000 times. Empty brass casings tumbled out of the aircraft, glinting in the weak sunlight before falling toward the sea below. Each 50-caliber machine gun could fire 800 rounds per minute. 13 guns per aircraft meant a combined rate of fire exceeding 10,000 rounds per minute. The gun barrels heated rapidly, the metal glowing faintly even in daylight. Overheated guns could jam or even explode. Gunners were trained to fire in short bursts, 3 to 5 seconds maximum, allowing the barrels to cool between engagements. The French coast appeared as a dark line on the horizon at 0955 hours. Flak began immediately, black puffs of smoke appearing in the sky ahead, each representing an 88mm shell that had exploded at a predetermined altitude. The German coastal batteries fired predictive barrages, calculating where the bomber stream would be based on speed, altitude, and heading. Most shells exploded harmlessly, but occasionally one detonated close enough to shake an aircraft with its concussion. Shrapnel, jagged fragments of steel casing traveling at supersonic speed, could punch through aluminum skin, sever control cables, puncture fuel tanks, or kill crew members instantly. Rosenthal watched the flak bursts, trying to discern a pattern. Some batteries fired in groups of four black puffs appearing simultaneously in a square pattern. Others fired sequentially, walking their fire across the sky like deadly stepping stones. The best pilots learned to make gentle and predictable heading changes, 5 degrees left, hold for 30 seconds, then 5 degrees right, making it harder for ground predictors to calculate the aircraft's future position. But these maneuvers had to be subtle. Aggressive evasive action would break up the formation, leaving isolated aircraft vulnerable to fighter attack. The P-47 Thunderbolt escorts appeared at 10:15 hours, sleek, powerful fighter aircraft painted in olive drab and bray, their distinctive bubble canopies glinting in the sunlight. They took up positions above and on the flanks of the bomber formation, weaving back and forth to maintain their slower speed while matching the bomber's course. Their presence was immensely reassuring. The P-47 was heavily armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns and could absorb tremendous battle damage. But everyone knew the terrible truth. The P-47's combat radius was only 375 miles. The German border was 400 miles from England. Once the escort turned back, the bomber crews would be alone. The formation crossed into Belgium at 10:40 hours, climbing steadily toward their operational altitude of 25,000 feet. The temperature outside had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Inside the unpressurized aircraft, crew members wore heavy sheepskin flight suits, leather gloves over silk glove liners, and felt-lined boots. Despite this protection, the cold was overwhelming, a deep, penetrating cold that made every movement difficult, every breath painful. Moisture from exhaled breath froze instantly on oxygen masks, creating thick layers of ice that had to be periodically chipped away to prevent the masks from sealing against faces. At 11:10 hours, the formation reached the German border near Aachen. The P-47 escorts began waggling their wings, the signal for departure. One by one, the American fighters peeled away, turning back toward England and the safety of friendly territory. Rosenthal watched them go, feeling a hollow sensation in his chest. The fighter pilots would be back at their bases in 90 minutes, drinking hot coffee in warm ready rooms. The bomber crews had 4 more hours over enemy territory. 4 hours of German fighters, 4 hours of flak, 4 hours of mechanical failures, and human endurance stretched to its absolute limit. Staff Sergeant Murphy's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with tension. Radio to crew. Escort has departed. We're on our own. Keep your eyes open. Fighters inbound from 12 o'clock high. The German fighters came out of the sun at 11:17 hours. 24 Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving at nearly 400 miles per hour, their yellow nose markings identifying them as aircraft from Jagdgeschwader 1, veterans of 3 years of combat on the eastern and western fronts. They opened fire at 800 yards, their 20mm cannon shells and 13mm machine gun rounds converging on the lead squadron. Tracers, glowing white-hot streaks, laced through the formation like deadly fireflies. The B-17's top turret and nose guns returned fire, creating a criss-crossing web of tracers between the bombers and their attackers. "Fighters, 12 o'clock high," Sergeant Booley shouted from the top turret, his twin 50 calibers already hammering. The turret rotated smoothly, tracking a Bf-109 as it flashed past at a combined closing speed of 550 miles per hour. The engagement lasted 3 seconds. The German fighter rolled inverted and dove away, trailing black smoke. Whether from battle damage or engine overstress, nobody could tell. 2 more fighters took its place immediately, attacking from slightly different angles, never giving the gunners a stationary target. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Lieutenant James Douglas and Navigator Lieutenant Samuel Barr crouched behind their .50 caliber cheek guns, tracking targets through the plexiglass nose. A Focke-Wulf FW-190, stockier and more aggressive-looking than the Bf-109, came straight at them, head-on, its wing-mounted cannons flickering with muzzle flashes. Douglas pressed his triggers, feeling the gun buck against his shoulder. His tracers walked across the sky toward the German fighter. For a frozen moment, it seemed the 2 aircraft would collide. Then the FW-190 flipped onto its wing and dived beneath the formation, so close that Douglas could see the pilot's leather helmet and oxygen mask. "Jesus Christ!" Barr shouted, his voice cracking. "Did you see that? He couldn't have been more than 50 feet away!" But there was no time to process fear. 3 more fighters were already setting up for their attack runs, coming from 2 o'clock high. The defensive fire from the bomber formation intensified, hundreds of machine guns firing simultaneously, creating a storm of lead and tracer fire that filled the sky with deadly geometry. A Bf-109 flew directly into this maelstrom and simply disintegrated. One moment an aircraft, the next a tumbling mass of metal fragments and fire. "Jesus Christ!" Barr shouted, his voice cracking. "Did you see that? He couldn't have been more than 50 feet away." But there was no time to process fear. 3 more fighters were already setting up for their attack runs, coming from 2 o'clock high. The defensive fire from the bomber formation intensified, hundreds of machine guns firing simultaneously, creating a storm of lead and tracer fire that filled the sky with deadly geometry. A Bf-109 flew directly into this maelstrom and simply disintegrated. One moment an aircraft, the next a tumbling mass of metal fragments and fire. But the Germans were scoring hits too. A B-17 in the low squadron, cabin in the sky, took a direct cannon strike to its number 2 engine. The engine exploded in a geyser of flame and oil, the propeller windmilling uselessly. The pilot, Captain Rosbert, immediately feathered the damaged engine, rotating the propeller blades edge-on to reduce drag, and applied full power to the remaining 3 engines. The bomber fell out of formation, losing altitude, unable to maintain speed. It was a death sentence. Isolated bombers were easy prey for German fighters, who would swarm them like sharks sensing blood in the water. Rosenthal forced himself to look away from the crippled B-17. His job was to fly formation, maintain position, keep his crew alive. He couldn't help cabin in the sky. Nobody could.
Through the cockpit windows, he saw another B-17, this one from the 390th Bomb Group, streaming white vapor from a punctured fuel tank. The vapor trail was beautiful in the sunlight, like a bridal veil, but it marked the aircraft as clearly as a spotlight. German fighters orbited the formation like wolves, picking off stragglers, attacking damaged aircraft that couldn't defend themselves effectively.
Bull turret to pilot. 2 FW-190s coming up from 6 o'clock low. Johnson's voice was high-pitched with adrenaline. He rotated his turret to face backward, his guns tracking the approaching fighters. The FW-190s came in fast and flat, using the bomber formation's blind spot, directly below and behind, where the overlapping fields of fire were weakest. Johnson opened fire at 600 yards, his tracers arcing downward. The lead FW-190 jinked left, then right, making himself a difficult target. At 300 yards, the German pilot opened fire. His round stitched a line across the B-17's tail section, punching fist-sized holes through the aluminum skin. Tail gunner George Moffat felt the impacts, a rapid series of metallic bangs and crashes. His compartment filled with swirling aluminum fragments and the scream of wind through bullet holes. One round struck his ammunition can, detonating several rounds in a chain reaction of explosions. Moffat threw himself against the fuselage wall, covering his face with his arms. When the explosion stopped, he checked himself quickly. No blood, no pain, no wounds. Miraculous. His guns were still functional. He swung them toward the retreating FW-190 and fired a long burst, more in anger than with any real hope of hitting. The fighter was already 800 yards away, diving for safety. The attacks continued without pause. As soon as one wave of German fighters exhausted their ammunition and broke away, fresh aircraft arrived to take their place. The Luftwaffe had developed tactics specifically for bomber destruction, head-on attacks that gave gunners minimal tracking time, coordinated assaults from multiple directions simultaneously, and the deployment of specialized destroyer aircraft, twin-engined Bf-110s and Me-410s carrying 20mm and 30mm cannons, along with rockets designed to break up bomber formations from beyond .50 caliber range. At 11:45 hours, a formation of 6 Me-410s appeared at 2 o'clock high, orbiting outside the range of the bomber's defensive fire. They fired rockets, Werfer 21 projectiles, trailing smoke as they arced toward the B-17s. The rockets were unguided and inaccurate, but they didn't need to hit. A single 40-pound warhead exploding in the middle of a tight formation could destroy or damage multiple aircraft simultaneously. Rosenthal watched the rockets approach, their trajectories clearly visible, and realized with cold horror that one was headed directly toward their position. "Brace! Brace!" he shouted into the intercom. The rocket passed 20 feet above the cockpit and exploded behind them. A brilliant orange flash followed by a concussion wave that slammed into Rosie's riveters like a physical blow. The bomber pitched violently upward, then rolled left. Rosenthal fought the controls, his arms straining against the yoke. The artificial horizon tumbled uselessly. The airspeed indicator fluctuated wildly. For 3 seconds he flew purely by instinct and muscle memory, wrestling the aircraft back to level flight, retrimming the controls, checking the engine instruments for damage. "Damage report," he commanded. One by one, crew positions checked in. Nose compartment intact, top turret functional, radio room operational, waist guns working, ball turret undamaged, tail position secure. By some miracle, the rocket explosion had caused no structural damage. But the B-17 50 feet to their right hadn't been so lucky. Liberty Bell was on fire, not the controllable fire of a damaged engine, but the catastrophic fire of ignited fuel and hydraulic fluid. Flames engulfed the entire right wing, melting aluminum, consuming oxygen, generating temperatures that turned structural members into taffy. The crew of Liberty Bell didn't hesitate. They knew exactly what that fire meant. The intercom discipline broke down into shouted orders and acknowledged commands. 30 seconds of controlled chaos as 10 men grabbed parachutes, opened hatches, and prepared to jump from a burning aircraft at 24,000 feet. Rosenthal watched, unable to help, unable to look away, as dark figures tumbled from the bomb bay and waist windows. 1, 2, 3, 4 parachutes blossomed white against the blue sky. Then Liberty Bell exploded, a massive fireball that consumed the remaining crew members and sent burning fragments tumbling toward the German countryside 25,000 feet below. MacDonald's voice was barely a whisper. "That's 6 men gone. Just gone." Rosenthal said nothing. There was nothing to say. 6 men dead. 4 parachuting into German territory, facing capture, interrogation, and years in POW camps if they survived the landing, if angry civilians didn't lynch them first, if German troops reached them before they froze to death. The mission had been underway for less than 2 hours. They hadn't even reached the target yet. The bomber stream stretched across 40 miles of German sky, leaving contrails, long white vapor trails formed by engine exhaust condensing in the frigid stratosphere that marked their course as clearly as a highway. For the German fighter controllers on the ground, tracking the formation required no sophisticated technology. They simply looked up. Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader II, coordinated his attacks from a command post near Frankfurt, vectoring fresh fighter squadrons toward the American formation with ruthless efficiency. He had over 300 aircraft at his disposal, more than enough to overwhelm the bomber defenses through sheer numbers and aggressive tactics. At 12:03 hours, the attack intensified. German fighters began executing coordinated assault patterns, 6 aircraft attacking simultaneously from 12 o'clock high, while another 6 came in from 6 o'clock level, forcing the B-17 gunners to divide their attention and fire. The defensive crossfire that protected the formation against single attackers became less effective when multiple fighters approached from opposite directions. The mathematics of aerial combat favored the attackers. A bomber needed to maintain course and speed. A fighter could dive, climb, roll, and maneuver at will. Rosie's riveters shuddered as a line of 20mm cannon strikes walked across the left wing. 3 holes appeared in rapid succession, punched through the aluminum skin as if it were paper. 1 round struck the number 1 engine cowling, but miraculously missed the engine itself, ricocheting away in a shower of sparks. Rosenthal felt the control yoke jerk in his hands as a hydraulic line severed, spraying pressurized fluid that immediately froze into pink mist in the sub-zero air. The aileron control became heavier, more resistant. Not impossible to use, but requiring more physical force. His arms would be burning with fatigue long before they reached England. Sergeant Swank, manning the right waist gun, tracked a Bf-109 that had made a firing pass and was pulling away in a climbing turn. He led the target, aiming ahead of the fighter's flight path, and pressed his triggers. The gun hammered against his shoulder, the muzzle blast creating a vortex of propellant gases. His traces converged with the German fighter just after the cockpit. Pieces of the Bf-109's tail assembly tore away. The fighter's nose dropped sharply, transitioning from a controlled climb to an uncontrolled dive. Swank watched it fall, spiraling toward the earth, trailing smoke and debris. He felt no elation, no triumph, only grim satisfaction that 1 fewer fighter would threaten his aircraft. But for every German fighter shot down or driven off, 2 more seemed to take its place. The Luftwaffe pilots were experienced, many with hundreds of combat missions against Soviet aircraft on the Eastern Front. They understood deflection shooting, the complex geometry of intercepting a moving target from a moving platform. They knew exactly where to aim to hit a B-17's most vulnerable points: the cockpit, the engines, the fuel tanks in the wings, the oxygen system. A single 20mm high explosive shell in the right location could destroy a bomber that weighed 30 tons and cost $238,000, roughly $4 million in today's currency. At 12:24 hours, a B-17 from the 381st Bomb Group, Eager Beaver, took a direct hit to its bomb bay. The bombs were still armed, still set to detonate over Schweinfurt. The impact from the German cannon shell didn't directly detonate them. Bombs required specific fusing sequences to explode. But it damaged the bomb release mechanism and punctured the aircraft's oxygen system. The pilot, Major James Wilson, faced an impossible decision. He could attempt to continue with armed bombs rattling loose in a damaged bomb bay, or he could salvage the mission by attempting an emergency bombing run now, 20 minutes before reaching the target. Wilson chose survival. Bombardier, emergency release, salvo the entire load, now. In the nose compartment, the Bombardier hit the emergency release. All 8 bombs dropped simultaneously, tumbling away into empty sky. They would fall for nearly 5 miles before impacting in a German forest, their explosions scattering wildlife and terrifying civilians, but accomplishing no military objective. Eager Beaver immediately began a descending turn, heading for Switzerland, a neutral country 150 miles to the south. It was a desperate gamble. If they reached Swiss airspace, they would be interned for the duration of the war, but would survive. If German fighters caught them before the border, they would die. The 40th Bomb Group, flying in the high squadron of the combat wing, was being systematically destroyed. They had entered German airspace with 49 aircraft. Now, barely past Frankfurt, only 42 remained. 7 B-17s had been shot down in 30 minutes, 70 men killed, wounded, or captured. The formation tightened instinctively, the surviving aircraft moving closer together, seeking the illusory safety of mutual defense. But the tighter formation made navigation more difficult and increased the risk of mid-air collisions. In the violent turbulence created by 291 aircraft flying in close proximity, a momentary loss of attention could result in 2 bombers colliding, a disaster that would destroy both aircraft instantly. In the Bull turret, Sergeant Johnson rotated continuously, scanning the sky below and behind the formation. The Bull turret position offered unparalleled visibility, but created unique psychological stress. Johnson hung suspended in space with 360-degree views of the carnage. Burning aircraft falling like comets, parachutes drifting down toward uncertain fates, pieces of destroyed bombers tumbling past his position. He saw things the other gunners missed. The Bf-109 that exploded when its pilot misjudged a high-speed pullout and the aircraft disintegrated from excessive G-forces. The B-17 that broke in half, the tail section separating cleanly from the fuselage, both pieces falling independently. The American fighter pilot who parachuted from his damaged P-47 hours ago and was now drifting helplessly through the bomber formation, his parachute narrowly missing collision with a B-17's wing. The intercom chatter reflected the mounting stress. Voices that had been controlled and professional now carried edges of fear and exhaustion. Fighters 3 o'clock high, 4 of them, maybe 5, can't get a count. Tail to crew, we've got more coming from 6 o'clock. Jesus, there must be 20 of them. Radio to pilot, I'm getting distress calls on guard frequency, multiple aircraft declaring emergency, can't acknowledge all of them. The disciplined radio procedure that instructors had drilled into them during training was breaking down under the reality of sustained combat. At 12:38 hours, Bombardier Lieutenant Douglas called forward. "Navigator, what's our position?" Lieutenant Barr checked his charts, cross-referencing landmarks visible through breaks in the clouds below. "We're approximately 25 miles northeast of Frankfurt. Schweinfurt is 60 miles ahead, bearing 095 degrees. 60 miles. At their current airspeed of 180 miles per hour, that meant 20 more minutes of German fighters, 20 more minutes of watching aircraft explode and men die, 20 more minutes before they could drop their bombs and turn for home. But home seemed impossibly distant. The bomber formation had penetrated 350 miles into Germany, deeper than any previous daylight raid. Every mile they flew eastward added 2 miles to their return journey. The fuel gauges showed steady decreases. Engineer Sergeant Bowley calculated consumption rates in his head, comparing actual burn against planned burn, adjusting for the damaged hydraulic system that was creating additional drag. His numbers were troubling. If fuel consumption continued at the current rate, they might not have enough to reach England. They would be forced to ditch in the North Sea or crash land on the European coast. Neither option was appealing. A new threat appeared at 12:47 hours, twin-engine Messerschmitt Me-410 destroyer aircraft, heavily armed with cannons and rockets, approaching from 11 o'clock level. These aircraft were purpose-built for bomber interception, sacrificing maneuverability for firepower and armor protection. They stayed just beyond effective 50 caliber range, 1,200 yards out, and fired their 30mm Mk108 cannons in long, deliberate bursts. The 30mm rounds were devastating. A single hit could sever a wing spar, destroy an engine, or blow a 10-foot hole in a fuselage. The B-17 gunners returned fire, but at 1,200 yards, the 50 caliber rounds had lost so much velocity that even direct hits often failed to penetrate the Me-410's armored cockpit. One of the 30mm rounds found its target, a B-17 named Knockout Dropper from the 351st Squadron. The shell struck the aircraft's number 3 engine, detonating inside the engine cowling. The explosion was catastrophic. The entire engine tore away from its mounting, tumbling into space, trailing flames and hydraulic fluid. The asymmetric thrust from the 3 remaining engines immediately yawed the bomber violently to the right. The pilot fought the controls, standing on the left rudder pedal with all his strength, advancing power on the left engines while retarding the right. For 15 seconds it seemed he might regain control. Then the right wing, weakened by the engine loss, simply folded upward, metal fatigue and aerodynamic stress combining to break the wing spar. Knockout Dropper rolled inverted and entered a flat spin, rotating like a falling leaf, utterly uncontrollable. No parachutes emerged. 10 men rode the aircraft down. By 12:55 hours, the bomber stream had been reduced to a ragged line of damaged aircraft fighting to maintain formation cohesion. The lead navigator announced over the command frequency, "All aircraft, IP in 5 minutes, prepare for bomb run." IP, initial point, marked the beginning of the final bombing approach, where bombardiers would take control of the aircraft through their northern bomb sites, making minute adjustments to heading and altitude to ensure accurate delivery. For the next 10 minutes, evasive action would be impossible. The bombers would fly straight and level regardless of flak or fighters, presenting perfect targets to German defenders who had been preparing for exactly this moment since August. Lieutenant Douglas moved to his bombardier position in the nose, flipping switches on the Norden bomb site, a complex mechanical computer that calculated drift, altitude, airspeed and trajectory to determine the precise moment to release bombs. The site cost $8,000, more than a luxury automobile, and was classified as one of America's most closely guarded military secrets. Bombardiers had sworn oaths to destroy the device rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands. Douglas activated the bomb site's gyroscopic stabilization system and began making preliminary calculations, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the cold that made every finger feel like frozen wood. The German fighter attacks suddenly ceased at 12:58 hours. The Luftwaffe pilots knew what was coming next. They pulled away from the bomber formation, climbing to safe altitudes and orbiting in wide circles, waiting. The sudden absence of fighters created an eerie silence. No more traces, no more cannon fire, no more shouted warnings over the intercom. For 30 seconds, the only sounds were engine noise and wind whistling through bullet holes in the fuselage. Then the flak began. The first burst appeared at 12:59 hours, a black puff of smoke at exactly 25,000 feet, 200 yards ahead of the formation. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the sky ahead transformed into a forest of black explosions, each representing an 88mm shell that had climbed 5 miles into the sky and detonated with precisely timed fuses. The German flak batteries around Schweinfurt included over 200 guns, organized in coordinated networks controlled by sophisticated fire direction centers. Radar provided altitude and range. Optical rangefinders tracked bearing. Mechanical computers calculated lead and predicted the formation's future position. The result was a killing zone of exploding steel that filled a cubic mile of airspace. "Flak suits on," Rosenthal ordered unnecessarily. Every crew member had already donned their flak vests, heavy garments of layered nylon and manganese steel plates designed to stop shrapnel fragments. The vests weighed 20 pounds and covered only the torso, leaving arms, legs and head vulnerable. Some crew members sat on their flak vests, protecting their genitals and femoral arteries from fragments coming through the aircraft's thin belly. The vests could stop low-velocity shrapnel, but were useless against direct hits from 88mm shells. The first shells exploded close enough to rock Rosie's riveters with their concussion. Rosenthal felt the impact through the control yoke, sharp jolts that made the aircraft shudder. Shrapnel clanged against the fuselage, creating a sound like hail on a tin roof. A fragment the size of a man's thumb punched through the cockpit floor between Rosenthal's feet, missing his leg by inches, and exited through the roof, leaving 2 jagged holes that admitted screaming wind. MacDonald flinched but maintained his grip on the throttles, his eyes locked on the instrument panel.
In the radio room, Technical Sergeant Murphy heard a sharp crack followed by a hissing sound. A shrapnel fragment had punctured the aircraft's oxygen system, severing a feed line. Pressurized oxygen vented into the radio compartment, creating a dangerous fire hazard. Murphy grabbed the emergency shutoff valve and cranked it closed, isolating the damaged section. He then switched to his emergency oxygen bottle, a small portable tank that would last perhaps 30 minutes, long enough to complete the bomb run, maybe long enough to get clear of the flak zone. He keyed his intercom. "Radio to pilot, we've lost main oxygen in the radio compartment. I'm on emergency bottle. System is still functioning for other positions." The waist gunners, Swank and Cruikshank, stood at their windows watching the flak bursts march through the formation with mechanical precision. Each explosion created a sphere of lethal fragments traveling at 3,000 feet per second. A man caught in that sphere would be torn apart. An aircraft caught in it could be gutted. They watched a B-17, 200 yards to their left, take a direct hit, an 88mm shell exploding inside the bomb bay. The bomber didn't catch fire or explode. It simply broke apart, the fuselage fracturing into 3 distinct pieces that tumbled away independently. No parachutes emerged. The crew had been killed instantly by the explosion or incapacitated by the violent breakup. 10 more men gone in the space of a single heartbeat.
Bombardier Douglas focused on his bomb site, blocking out the flak, the fear, the knowledge that he was the reason they couldn't take evasive action. His entire world narrowed to the crosshairs of the Norden site and the target approaching in the view below, a cluster of industrial buildings surrounded by worker housing, rail yards and storage facilities. The Kugelfischer ball bearing plant. 3 large factory buildings and associated infrastructure that produced bearings for German aircraft, tanks and vehicles. Intelligence estimated that destroying this single complex would reduce German ball bearing production by 40%. "Pilot, this is Bombardier. I have the aircraft." Douglas's statement transferred control from Rosenthal to the bomb site's automatic mechanism. Tiny adjustments to heading and pitch were now being made automatically by the Norden servo motors, steering toward the calculated release point. Rosenthal took his hands off the yoke, but kept his feet on the rudder pedals, ready to override if necessary. The aircraft bucked and shuddered as flak bursts walked closer, but the bomb site compensated, maintaining the required heading with mechanical precision. At 13:04 hours, the formation began its final approach. Altitude 25,000 feet. Airspeed 180 miles per hour. Heading 095 degrees. Wind 15 knots from the northwest. Temperature -42 degrees Celsius. The bomb bay doors opened, creating additional drag and turbulence. The armed bombs hung in their racks, suspended by mechanical shackles that would release on electrical command from the bomb site. Each 500-pound general-purpose bomb contained 265 pounds of tritonal explosive, a mixture of TNT and aluminium powder designed to create blast overpressure and fragmentation effects. A flak burst exploded directly beneath Rosie's riveters, close enough that the concussion lifted the entire aircraft 10 feet higher in the sky. Shrapnel tore through the bomb bay, severing cables and puncturing the hydraulic reservoir. Red hydraulic fluid sprayed across the bombs, freezing instantly into crystalline droplets. In the tail position, Sergeant Moffat was thrown against the fuselage wall, his head striking metal hard enough to split his leather helmet. Blood ran down his face, warm against frozen skin, but he remained conscious, remained at his gun, knowing that the moment the bombs dropped, German fighters would resume their attacks. The lead bombardier's voice crackled over the command frequency. "Lead aircraft, bombs away." One by one, the bombardiers in the formation released their loads, creating a cascade effect. Douglas watched through his sight as the lead group's bombs fell away, tumbling end over end, arming mechanisms spinning as they descended. He made a final microscopic adjustment to the site's crosshairs, compensated for a slight drift, and pressed the release button. Bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosive dropped from the bomb bay. The shackles released simultaneously, sending all 8 bombs into free fall. Douglas watched them through the bomb site's optics for 3 seconds, confirming they were falling true, then switched to the camera, photographing the target area for post-strike analysis. Below, the first bombs from the lead group impacted the factory complex, creating brilliant flashes followed by rising pillars of smoke and debris. Secondary explosions rickled through the buildings as stored materials ignited. "Bomb bay doors closed," Rosenthal shouted, immediately throwing Rosie's riveters into a banking turn, breaking away from the target area. Other bombers followed, the entire formation disintegrating as individual aircraft maneuvered independently, seeking escape from the flak zone. The disciplined formations that had crossed Germany were gone, replaced by a scattered stream of damaged aircraft, each fighting its own battle to survive. And then the fighters returned. The Luftwaffe pilots had been waiting, conserving ammunition and fuel, watching the bomber formation navigate the flak barrage. Now, as the B-17s broke away from Schweinfurt in scattered groups, the German fighters pounced. At 13:12 hours, more than 100 enemy aircraft dove into the dispersed bombers like wolves separating wounded prey from the herd. The carefully orchestrated defensive formations that had provided mutual protection on the inbound flight no longer existed. Individual bombers and small groups of 2 or 3 aircraft struggled to rejoin larger formations while fighting off determined attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. Rosie's riveters was climbing hard, trying to regain altitude lost during evasive maneuvers, when 4 FW-190s attacked in a coordinated assault, 2 from 12 o'clock high, 2 from 3 o'clock level. The gunners engaged all 4 targets at once, their .50 caliber weapons hammering, filling the sky with traces. Top turret gunner Bowley tracked the high attackers, his guns traversing smoothly despite the cold that had frozen condensation on the turret's rotation mechanism. The lead FW-190 opened fire at 600 yards, its wing-mounted cannons flickering. Bowley saw his tracers converging with the fighter and kept firing, ignoring the German rounds that were stitching across the B-17's right wing. The F-190 suddenly rolled violently and dove away, trailing white smoke, either coolant or fuel vapor. Bowley didn't know if he'd scored fatal damage or merely forced the pilot to break off the attack. There was no time to assess. The second fighter was already making its pass, nose guns blazing. Rounds punched through the cockpit windscreen, starring the plexiglass with spiderweb cracks, showering Rosenthal and MacDonald with fragments. One round grazed MacDonald's shoulder, tearing through his leather flight jacket and sheepskin liner, but missing flesh by millimeters. He didn't even realize he'd been hit until he saw blood on his glove. The waist gunners engaged the fighters attacking from 3 o'clock, their guns firing in overlapping arcs that created a wall of lead. Sergeant Cruikshank's weapon jammed. A spent casing had failed to eject properly, blocking the chamber. He yanked back the charging handle, cleared the jam, and resumed firing, all within 5 seconds. His target, an FW-190 bearing the markings of Jagdgeschwader 26, pressed its attack to point-blank range before breaking away. Cruikshank saw the German pilot clearly. Leather helmet, oxygen mask, white silk scarf, close enough to make eye contact. For that frozen instant, they were not enemies representing opposing ideologies, but simply 2 young men trying to kill each other before being killed themselves. At 13:24 hours, Rosie's riveters managed to join up with 3 other B-17s from different bomb groups, forming an ad hoc defensive formation. Flying in close proximity provided mutual fire support, but these 4 aircraft didn't know each other's call signs, radio frequencies, or flight characteristics. They had never trained together, never developed the intuitive understanding that came from months of formation flying. Yet they had no choice. Isolated bombers rarely survived. The 4 aircraft tucked together as tightly as possible, their pilots struggling to maintain position while managing damaged systems and wounded crew members. The navigator, Lieutenant Barr, worked frantically to plot a return course to England. His maps were scattered, some torn by shrapnel, others marked with blood from a cut on his hand. He used celestial navigation, calculating position based on the sun's angle, and dead reckoning, estimating distance traveled based on airspeed and time. His calculations were complicated by the winds aloft, which had shifted since the inbound flight, and by the fact that Rosie's riveters was no longer flying at optimal altitude or speed. Damaged hydraulics and battle damage had reduced their maximum speed to 160 miles per hour. At that rate, England was still 3.5 hours away. Luftweiters continued to harass the bomber stream throughout the withdrawal. The Luftweiter pilots knew the Americans were damaged, low on ammunition, and psychologically exhausted. Some fighters made mock attacks, feinting as if to engage, then breaking away, forcing gunners to expend precious ammunition on targets that never came into effective range. Other fighters simply shadowed the formation, radioing positions to ground controllers, directing fresh aircraft toward the retreating bombers. It was a sustained campaign of attrition, bleeding the Americans with 1,000 small cuts. At 1:34:07 hours, one of the B-17s in their makeshift formation, a bomber from the 303rd Bomb Group, began trailing smoke from its number 4 engine. The pilot feathered the engine, stopping the propeller's rotation, but the smoke continued, growing thicker and darker. Then flames appeared, licking back from the engine cowling along the wing's trailing edge. The fire was eating through aluminum skin, approaching the wing's main fuel tank. The pilot held formation for another 90 seconds, trying to extinguish the blaze using the aircraft's fire suppression system, a charge of carbon dioxide that could be dumped into the engine compartment. The fire didn't diminish.
The decision was made without drama or delay. The bomber's nose dropped slightly as it departed the formation, descending toward lower altitude, where the thicker air might help extinguish the flames. Rosenthal watched it go, knowing that leaving formation was suicidal, but understanding that staying in formation with an uncontrollable fire was equally fatal. The burning B-17 descended through 20,000 feet, then 15,000, the flames now engulfing the entire right wing. At 10,000 feet, the wing separated from the fuselage. The bomber rolled inverted and fell, tumbling like a leaf. 6 parachutes deployed. 4 men didn't make it out. The remaining 3 aircraft tightened their formation, closing the gap left by the departed bomber. They were now over central Germany, approximately 200 miles from the Dutch border, fighting headwinds that reduced their ground speed to barely 140 miles per hour. Fuel was becoming critical. Engineer Booley called out tank readings every 15 minutes, his voice flat and professional despite the numbers he was reporting. They had burned more fuel than planned, the result of combat maneuvers, damaged engines running inefficiently, and the need to maintain higher than optimal power settings to stay with the formation.
In the ball turret, Sergeant Johnson rotated his position to scan for fighters and saw something that made his breath catch. Far below, at perhaps 8,000 feet, a lone B-17 was under attack by 6 German fighters. The bomber was turning, weaving, trying desperately to bring guns to bear, but it was overwhelmed. Johnson watched, helpless to intervene, unable to look away, as the B-17's left wing folded upward, broken by cannon fire. The aircraft rolled onto its back and dove vertically, streaming smoke and debris. No parachutes. He keyed his intercom but said nothing. What was there to say? Another 10 men dead. The numbers were becoming abstract, incomprehensible. At 14:18 hours, they crossed into Belgium. The German fighter attacks didn't cease. The Luftwaffe pursued bomber formations well into occupied territory, but the intensity decreased. Ammunition expended, fuel states critical, and the knowledge that British Spitfires were now within range all contributed to the gradual withdrawal of enemy fighters. The last confirmed attack came at 14:31 hours, a lone Bf-109 that made a half-hearted pass from 7 o'clock high, fired a short burst that missed by 50 yards, and dove away toward Germany. Radio operator Murphy began receiving signals from friendly stations, British coastal defence radars, rescue coordination centres, air-sea rescue frequencies. The voices speaking English, offering assistance and navigational guidance, were almost unbearably reassuring. Murphy responded with Rosie's riveter's call sign, current position, fuel state, and damage assessment. The British controller's response was immediate. Roger, understand, emergency services standing by. You're cleared direct to any suitable field. Suggested heading 270, distance 120 miles to Manston Emergency Field. Manston, a long runway on England's southeast coast specifically designed for emergency landings. No questions asked, no radio procedures required. Just land, get medical attention for wounded crew members, refuel if possible, and return to home base when practical. It was a lifeline, and Rosenthal altered course immediately, steering toward that distant sanctuary. The Dutch coast appeared at 15:09 hours, a grey-brown line separating dark water from darker land. The flak batteries along the coast fired a few desultory salvos, more habit than genuine threat, the shells exploding well below the bomber's altitude. Then they were over the North Sea, 60 miles of cold water between them and England. This was traditionally when crews relaxed, knowing the fighters couldn't follow, knowing rescue aircraft and vessels patrolled these waters.
But Rosie's riveters still had 3 engines running, still had hydraulic pressure, minimal but functional, and still had a crew that was battered but alive. In the waist, Sergeant Swank finally released his grip on his gun's charging handle, flexing fingers that had been locked in position for 4 hours. His hands were shaking, fine tremors he couldn't control, adrenaline withdrawal and exhaustion combining to overwhelm his nervous system. Cruikshank was counting bullet holes in the fuselage, trying to occupy his mind with something concrete, something that didn't involve memories of exploding aircraft and falling men. He stopped counting at 73 holes. There were more, but he'd lost interest in the tally. The English coast materialized through the afternoon haze at 15:42 hours, the white chalk cliffs of Dover rising from the sea like a promise of salvation. Rosenthal felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it began to release. But relief was premature. The landing checklist still had to be completed, and Rosie's riveters was flying on compromised systems with battle damage that might worsen during the descent and landing sequence. MacDonald reached for the landing gear lever, hesitated, then looked at Rosenthal. "If the hydraulics fail completely when we extend the gear, we'll have no brakes, no flaps, no steering." Rosenthal nodded. "Then we'll belly it in, but let's try the gear first." MacDonald pulled the landing gear lever down. The hydraulic pumps whined, a labouring sound that suggested fluid levels dangerously low and pressure barely adequate. The main gear position indicators showed disagreement. Left main gear down and locked, right main gear showing in transit, tail wheel position unknown. Rosenthal began a gentle turn to allow the crew to visually inspect the gear through the waist windows. Swank leaned out into the slipstream, squinting against the wind, and confirmed what the indicators suggested. The right main gear was only partially extended, cocked at an angle that would collapse on touchdown. "We're going to have to crank it down manually," Rosenthal announced over the intercom. The B-17 had a manual gear extension system, a hand crank in the radio room, connected by cables and gears to the landing gear mechanism. It required approximately 50 revolutions of the crank to extend the gear fully, each revolution requiring significant physical force. Murphy and Boorley moved to the radio room and began cranking, taking turns every 10 revolutions as their arms burned with fatigue. The crank turned with agonizing slowness, fighting hydraulic pressure that should have been helping but was instead creating resistance in the damaged system. After 8 minutes of continuous cranking, Swank called forward. "Right main looks down and locked now." The indicator light finally illuminated green, confirming all 3 landing gear struts were extended and mechanically locked. But the hydraulic pressure gauge was reading 0. They had gear, but no flaps, no brakes, no nose wheel steering. Landing would be a controlled crash, touching down at higher than normal speed, unable to slow effectively, steering with rudder and asymmetric engine power alone. Rosenthal calculated the numbers in his head. Normal landing speed, 90 miles per hour. Landing speed without flaps, 120 miles per hour. Manston's runway was 9,000 feet long. Plenty of length if everything went perfectly, marginal if anything went wrong. The British controller's voice crackled over the radio. "All aircraft, Manston Tower. Be advised, runway 28 is active. Wind 290 at 12 knots. Crash and rescue standing by. You're cleared to land at pilot's discretion. No sequence required. Emergency vehicles are positioned along the runway." That last detail was both reassuring and ominous. Fire trucks and ambulances positioned along the runway meant the ground crews expected bad landings, expected crashes, expected casualties. At 16:04 hours, Rosenthal lined up on final approach, the runway stretching ahead like a concrete ribbon.
He kept power on all 3 functioning engines, maintaining 140 miles per hour until the last possible moment. MacDonald called out altitudes: 500 feet, 400, 300. At 200 feet, Rosenthal began reducing power, allowing the bomber's nose to drop slightly, trading altitude for airspeed in a careful balance. The runway threshold passed beneath them. 100 feet, 50. Rosenthal pulled the throttles to idle and eased back on the yoke, flaring the aircraft for touchdown. The F-190 suddenly rolled violently and dove away, trailing white smoke, either coolant or fuel vapor. Bowley didn't know if he'd scored fatal damage or merely forced the pilot to break off the attack. There was no time to assess. The second fighter was already making its pass, nose guns blazing. Rounds punched through the cockpit windscreen, starring the plexiglass with spiderweb cracks, showering Rosenthal and MacDonald with fragments. One round grazed MacDonald's shoulder, tearing through his leather flight jacket and sheepskin liner, but missing flesh by millimeters. He didn't even realize he'd been hit until he saw blood on his glove. Rosie's riveters finally rolled to a stop at 16:07 hours, 8,400 feet down the runway, with 600 feet to spare. Rosenthal sat motionless for 10 seconds, his hands still gripping the control yoke, unable to immediately process that they were down, that they had survived. MacDonald reached over and shut down the engines one by one. The sudden silence was overwhelming. No engine roar, no wind scream, no gunfire, no explosions. Just the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of emergency vehicles approaching. The crew evacuated through the waste door, stumbling onto English soil with legs that barely functioned after 10 hours cramped in combat positions. Medics swarmed them immediately, checking for wounds, assessing shock, offering water and cigarettes. Tail gunner Moffat's head wound, forgotten in the intensity of combat, was bleeding freely, and he was guided to an ambulance for treatment. The others stood in a loose group beside their aircraft, smoking, not speaking, staring at the damage their bomber had sustained. The fuselage was riddled with holes, hundreds of them, ranging from 30 caliber bullet punctures to 20mm cannon strikes the size of dinner plates. The right wing showed a section where 3 feet of aluminum skin had been torn away completely, exposing ribs and stringers. The vertical stabilizer had a hole large enough to climb through. Hydraulic fluid and fuel had leaked from various punctures, leaving rainbow-colored stains across the aluminum. Ground crew technicians walked slowly around the aircraft, shaking their heads, taking photographs, making notes. One crew chief, a British sergeant with 20 years of service, approached Rosenthal and spoke with professional understatement. "She's a bit dinged up, sir. Surprised she made it home." At 16:45 hours, a jeep arrived carrying an intelligence officer with a portable typewriter and a stack of forms. The debriefing began immediately. Standard procedure, conducted while memories were fresh and before exhaustion and shock dulled recollection. "Talk me through it from takeoff," the officer requested, fingers poised over the typewriter keys. For 90 minutes, the crew reconstructed the mission. Number of enemy fighters encountered, types and markings of aircraft, locations of flak concentrations, observed results of the bombing, aircraft seen going down, parachutes counted, anything and everything that might contribute to the intelligence picture. The officer's questions were specific and probing. "You reported seeing a B-17 from the 390th Bomb Group streaming vapor at approximately 11:25 hours. Did you observe what happened to that aircraft?" Rosenthal closed his eyes, trying to separate one burning bomber from the dozens he'd witnessed. "Negative. Lost visual contact when we took evasive action. Don't know if they made it or not." The officer typed steadily, creating an official record that would be analyzed, compiled with other crew reports, and eventually transformed into mission statistics. Aircraft lost, enemy fighters destroyed, bombing accuracy, lessons learned. As the debriefing concluded, a truck arrived carrying crews from other aircraft that had landed at Manston. The men gathered in small groups, comparing experiences, asking about missing friends, searching for information about bombers that hadn't returned. Someone mentioned that the 305th Bomb Group had lost 13 aircraft, an entire squadron wiped out in a single mission. Someone else reported that the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, had lost 12. The numbers accumulated, each representing 10 men, each adding to the mounting casualty toll.
A transport aircraft arrived at 18:30 hours to ferry crews back to their home bases across East Anglia. As Rosie's riveters' crew climbed aboard, Rosenthal took a final look at their bomber, now surrounded by maintenance crews, assessing whether it could be repaired or would be scrapped for parts. The aircraft had brought them to Germany and back, absorbing punishment that should have destroyed it, holding together through a combination of engineering excellence and sheer luck. Whether it would fly again was uncertain. Whether its crew would fly again was equally uncertain. The transport lifted off at 18:55 hours, climbing into the evening sky. Through the windows, the crew could see other damaged B-17s scattered across Manston and neighbouring emergency fields, aircraft with engines missing, tails shot away, fuselages bent and twisted. The sky above England was full of crippled bombers, all heading home, all counting the cost of Black Thursday. The transport aircraft touched down at Thorpe Abbotts at 20:47 hours, the base's runway outlined by dim blue taxiway lights that barely penetrated the October darkness. As the crew disembarked, they were struck by the silence. The normal sounds of an active bomber base, engines being tested, ground crews shouting instructions, tractors pulling bomb carts, were absent. The hard stands that had been filled with B-17s that morning now held empty spaces marked only by oil stains on the concrete. The ground crews stood in small clusters, smoking, waiting, counting aircraft as they returned. Their faces told the story before any words were spoken. Rosenthal walked toward the operations building, his legs moving mechanically despite exhaustion that had seeped into his bones. The group intelligence officer, Major Wilson, stood outside smoking a cigarette, his clipboard tucked under one arm. He looked up as Rosenthal approached, and something in his expression made Rosenthal's stomach tighten. "How many?" Rosenthal asked quietly. Wilson took a long drag on his cigarette before answering. "Of our group, 12 aircraft didn't come back. 3 more crashed trying to land, total losses. 2 are so badly damaged they'll never fly again." He paused, doing the mathematics that everyone was doing. "That's 17 birds gone, 170 men." The numbers were incomprehensible. This morning, the 100 Bomb Group had launched 38 aircraft. Tonight, only 21 had returned in any condition to fly again. In a single mission, they had lost 45% of their combat strength, losses that would take months to replace, if they could be replaced at all. Rosenthal thought of the men he'd seen at breakfast, the poker game 2 nights ago, the crew that had borrowed tools from his crew chief last week. How many of them were gone? How many were prisoners in Germany? How many had died in burning aircraft or freezing North Sea waters? Inside the operations building, crews were still being debriefed, their voices flat and emotionless as they recounted what they'd witnessed. Lieutenant Luckadoo sat at one table, mechanically answering questions, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. His aircraft, just a snap-in, had returned with 2 engines shot out, the nose section so riddled with holes that the plexiglass looked like shattered crystal, and his navigator dead from a 20mm cannon shell that had exploded in the cockpit. Luckadoo had held the aircraft together for 4 hours, his navigator's body strapped in the seat beside him, blood freezing on the instruments. The intelligence officer conducting Luckadoo's debriefing asked standard questions with professional detachment, but his hands shook slightly as he typed. "Can you estimate the number of enemy fighters you engaged?" Luckadoo laughed, a sound without humor. "Estimate? There were hundreds of them. They were everywhere. We shot at so many I stopped counting.
Ask me how many we hit, I couldn't tell you. Ask me how many hit us, I couldn't tell you that either. We just kept shooting and somehow made it home." The officer typed steadily, translating chaos and terror into official language. Crew reports numerous enemy fighter contacts throughout mission profile. At the 305th Bomb Group's base at Chelveston, the scene was even more devastating. Ground crews had prepared 32 aircraft that morning. They watched 16 return. The other 16, 160 men, were simply gone. Some had been seen going down over Germany. Others had disappeared into clouds or smoke and were never seen again. Their fate would remain unknown until German records were examined after the war, if there were records, if anyone survived to be recorded. The base commander, Colonel Curtis LeMay, walked among the hardstands in the darkness, stopping at each empty space, reading the names painted on the concrete. Battle in Betty, Oklahoma Okie, Mizpah, Liberty Run. Aircraft names without aircraft, ghosts marked only by paint and memory.
The 390th Bomb Group at Framlingham lost 11 aircraft. The 351st at Polebrook lost 9. The 381st at Ridgewell lost 8. Across East Anglia, the mathematics of catastrophe were being calculated in operations rooms and over field telephones. By midnight, preliminary totals began circulating. 60 B-17s confirmed destroyed over Germany, 5 crashed attempting to land in England, 12 so damaged they would be stripped for parts and never fly again. 77 bombers, more than 1/4 of the attacking force, lost in a single mission. Additionally, 122 aircraft had returned with battle damage, requiring extensive repairs, leaving only 33 bombers that had survived without damage. The human cost was staggering. Each bomber carried a crew of 10. 77 aircraft lost meant 770 men missing, killed instantly in fighter attacks, burned alive in fuel fires, suffocated at high altitude when oxygen systems failed, drowned in the North Sea, or captured after parachuting into Germany. Some had survived uninjured and would spend the next 2 years in POW camps. Others had been wounded during the mission and died of their injuries before reaching medical care. The exact number of dead wouldn't be known for days, possibly weeks, until casualty reports were compiled and prisoner lists received through neutral countries. In the mess hall at Thorpe Abbotts, the evening meal was served but barely touched. Men sat at tables, staring at empty chairs, processing the absence of friends who had been alive 12 hours ago. The normal rituals of military dining, the jokes, the complaints about food quality, the planning for evening activities were absent. People ate mechanically, their minds elsewhere, replaying the mission, questioning decisions, wondering why they had survived when so many others hadn't. The phenomenon that would later be called survivor's guilt had no name in 1943, but every man in that room felt its weight. Sergeant Johnson sat alone at a corner table, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to stop seeing the images that played in endless loops behind his eyes. The B-17 that had exploded 50 feet from his turret, close enough that he'd felt the heat through the plexiglass. The parachute with the dead man still attached, streaming blood that froze into red crystals. The fighter pilot's face in that split second of eye contact before bullets and physics and luck decided who would live and who would die. He was 19 years old. He'd aged decades in 10 hours. The chaplain, Captain Robert O'Malley, moved through the mess hall and barracks, offering comfort to those who wanted it, sitting quietly with those who didn't. He'd learned during his months with the 8th Air Force that sometimes the most important thing he could offer was simply presence. Another human being who acknowledged the horror and loss without trying to minimize it with platitudes about God's plan or noble sacrifice. These men had watched their friends die. They'd killed enemy pilots who were probably their age, who probably had similar dreams and fears.
They'd survived through a combination of skill, courage, and random chance. No amount of theology could make that easier to process. At 2300 hours, a staff car arrived at Thorpe Abbotts, carrying Major General Frederick Anderson, commander of 8th Bomber Command. He entered the operations building without ceremony, requested the mission statistics, and stood reading them in silence for 5 full minutes. Then he asked to speak with the group commander, Colonel Robert Kelly. The two men conferred privately for 30 minutes. Later, those who had been close enough to overhear reported that Anderson's first words were simply, "I'm sorry. This should never have happened." He didn't elaborate on what this meant, the mission itself, the losses, the doctrine that had sent bombers deep into Germany without adequate fighter escort. The apology hung in the air, sincere but insufficient. By midnight, teletype messages were being transmitted from 8th Bomber Command headquarters to Washington, D.C., where it was still evening. The messages contained preliminary casualty figures and tactical assessments. The conclusion was inescapable. The doctrine of unescorted daylight precision bombing had failed catastrophically. The B-17, for all its defensive armament and structural strength, could not defend itself against determined fighter opposition. The losses on October 14th were double the maximum sustainable rate. At this attrition level, the entire 8th Air Force would be destroyed in less than 2 months. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, received the reports at his Pentagon office and immediately convened a meeting with his senior staff. The discussions lasted until 0200 hours Washington time. By morning, decisions had been made. Deep penetration raids into Germany would be suspended until long-range escort fighters became available. The P-51 Mustang, a fighter aircraft with the range to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin, was being rushed into production, but wouldn't be available in significant numbers until early 1944. Until then, the daylight bombing campaign would focus on targets within P-47 escort range. The reveille horn sounded at 0600 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness with mechanical indifference. In Hut 7, Lieutenant Rosenthal opened his eyes to find himself fully dressed, still wearing his flight boots, lying on top of his bunk rather than in it. He had no memory of returning to the barracks or lying down. The exhaustion had been so complete that he'd simply ceased functioning, his body shutting down the moment it encountered anything resembling a bed. Around him, other pilots stirred slowly, their movements stiff and painful. Muscles that had been tensed for 10 hours of combat flying had tightened overnight into knots of cramped tissue. Around him, other pilots stirred slowly, their movements stiff and painful. Muscles that had been tensed for 10 hours of combat flying had tightened overnight into knots of cramped tissue. Around him, other pilots stirred slowly, their movements stiff and painful. Muscles that had been tensed for 10 hours of combat flying had tightened overnight into knots of cramped tissue. Around him, other pilots stirred slowly, their movements stiff and painful. Muscles that had been tensed for 10 hours of combat flying had tightened overnight into knots of cramped tissue. The usual morning rush to the latrines and mess hall didn't materialize. Men moved like sleepwalkers, performing routines through muscle memory while their minds remained elsewhere. The shower room, normally filled with banter and horseplay, was silent except for running water. Sergeant Johnson stood under a showerhead, letting hot water run over his face, watching the drain, not thinking about anything, because thinking meant remembering, and remembering was unbearable. The water eventually ran cold. He didn't notice. A hand touched his shoulder. Sergeant Swank, fully dressed, concerned. "Come on, kid, you've been in here 40 minutes. Time to get out." The mess hall offered the same powdered eggs and burned coffee as every morning, but the room was only half full. Empty tables reminded everyone of the men who weren't coming back. The cooks had prepared food for the expected number, 300 personnel, and now faced the surplus that represented human absence. Sergeant Thomas, the head cook, stood beside the serving line, his face rigid with the effort of maintaining composure. He'd fed these men yesterday morning, joking with them, scooping extra portions onto trays, listening to complaints about his cooking. Today he served the survivors and tried not to count the empty plates. At 700 hours, a notice was posted on the Operations Building bulletin board. No combat operations scheduled for October 15th. All crews stand down for rest and recovery. Aircraft maintenance personnel continue normal duties. Memorial service, 1400 hours, base chapel. The notice was unsigned, but the handwriting was recognized as belonging to Major Wilson, the group intelligence officer. Men gathered around the bulletin board, reading the notice multiple times, as if repetition would reveal hidden meaning. A day off, rest and recovery. But how could anyone rest when sleep brought nightmares of burning aircraft? How did one recover from watching friends die? The ground crews, who had worked through the night preparing aircraft for missions that wouldn't fly, now faced different tasks. Instead of loading bombs and filling fuel tanks, they were assessing battle damage, removing salvageable parts from aircraft too destroyed to repair, and preparing hangar space for bombers that could be rebuilt. Crew Chief Master Sergeant Bill Hansen stood before Rosie's riveters, his clipboard filled with damage reports. The list covered 3 pages. 73 bullet holes in the fuselage, 21 in the wings, 9 in the tail assembly. The right main landing gear strut was cracked and needed replacement. The hydraulic system required complete rebuilding. Number 1 engine showed cylinder damage from a near-miss flak burst and had to be changed. The plexiglass nose was so shattered it couldn't be patched. The entire section needed replacement. Hansen calculated repair time in his head, minimum 2 weeks if parts were available immediately, more likely a month given supply chain delays. Rosie's riveters would be in the hangar while other crews flew her missions, accumulated her combat hours, faced the same dangers that had nearly destroyed her yesterday. He felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness for the aircraft, this collection of aluminum and rivets that had brought his crew home despite damage that should have been fatal. Bombers became more than machines to the men who maintained them. They became partners in survival, and their damage felt personal. Across the base, small groups of men gathered spontaneously, drawn together by shared trauma and the human need for connection. In the motor pool, a cluster of administrative personnel, men who had spent yesterday at desks while their friends fought for survival over Germany, now struggled with guilt over their safety. Technical Sergeant Raymond Clark, a supply clerk, voiced what others were thinking. "We were here counting requisition forms while they were—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Nobody needed him to. The line between those who flew and those who didn't had always existed, but yesterday had made that line feel like a chasm. The base chaplain's office became an informal gathering place throughout the morning. Men arrived singly or in pairs, some wanting to talk, others simply wanting to sit in the presence of someone who acknowledged their pain without demanding explanations. Chaplain O'Malley had no answers, no theological framework that made October 14th make sense. He offered coffee, silence, and the occasional observation that survival didn't require justification. "You lived because you lived," he told one pilot who was drowning in survivor's guilt. "That's not theft from the men who died. It's just what happened. Honor them by continuing to live." At 11 o'clock hours, a telegram arrived at the base commander's office. It contained a single sentence from 8th Bomber Command Headquarters. "Deep penetration missions suspended indefinitely pending strategic review and availability of long-range escort fighters." Colonel Kelly read the telegram 3 times, then filed it in his desk drawer without sharing its contents. The men didn't need official confirmation that their sacrifice had proven a tactical doctrine wrong. They already knew. Every empty hardstand confirmed it. Every missing face at breakfast proved it. The question now was whether those losses had been meaningless or whether they had forced a necessary change that would save lives in the future. The base library, normally empty during morning hours, held a dozen men who had discovered that reading, immersing themselves in stories that had nothing to do with war, provided temporary escape from memory. Technical Sergeant Murphy sat in a corner with a dog-eared copy of The Grapes of Wrath, reading the same page repeatedly without comprehension, but finding comfort in the rhythm of Steinbeck's prose. Across the room, Lieutenant MacDonald, his shoulder bandaged where the German round had grazed him, struggled through a letter to his parents in Ohio. How did one describe yesterday? How did one convey horror to people safe in another world? He wrote 3 sentences, crossed them out, and started over. After 30 minutes, he had produced 2 paragraphs of generic reassurance that revealed nothing true. Sergeant Johnson walked the perimeter track that encircled the airfield, needing physical movement to burn off nervous energy that made sitting impossible. He counted his steps, focused on the simple mechanics of placing one foot ahead of the other, tried to exist only in the present moment rather than yesterday's memories or tomorrow's fears. Other men had the same idea. The perimeter track became an informal congregation of the restless, men walking alone or in pairs, not speaking, acknowledging each other with brief nods, sharing space without demands for interaction. At 12:30 hours, mail call brought letters from home, correspondence written days or weeks ago by families unaware that their sons, husbands, brothers and fathers had just survived one of the war's deadliest missions. The disconnect between the cheerful, ordinary content of the letters and the reality of yesterday created cognitive dissonance that was almost physically painful. Sergeant Booley's mother wrote about the neighbour's new baby, church socials, and her victory garden. She asked if he was eating well and staying warm. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in his locker, and didn't respond to the question that several crew members asked. Good news from home? There was no good news. There was only the unbridgeable gap between home and here, between people who hadn't seen what he'd seen and couldn't understand even if he found words to describe it. At 13:45 hours, men began moving toward the base chapel, a simple wooden structure that could accommodate perhaps 200 people when fully packed. By 1400 hours, more than 400 personnel crowded inside, lined the walls, and stood in clusters outside the open doors. The chapel had been designed for normal attendance, not for a memorial service commemorating 170 missing crew members from a single bomb group. Every pew was filled. Men sat on windowsills, leaned against walls, and stood in doorways. Those who couldn't fit inside gathered outside, their heads bowed, listening through the windows. The chapel's interior was austere, rough wooden benches, a simple altar, and a single cross mounted on the front wall. Someone had placed a B-17 squadron patch on the altar, surrounded by 17 candles, one for each aircraft lost from the 100th bomb group. The candles flickered in drafts from the ill-fitting windows, their small flames wavering but not extinguishing, a metaphor nobody needed to articulate. Chaplain O'Malley stood at the altar, in his dress uniform, his chaplain's cross glinting in the candlelight. His face showed exhaustion. He'd spent the previous night comforting the wounded, writing letters to families, and preparing this service. At precisely 1400 hours, O'Malley began without preamble or pleasantries. We gather today not to celebrate victory, though the mission achieved its tactical objectives. We gather not to glorify war, though we recognize the necessity of our cause. We gather to remember our brothers. 170 men from this group alone who yesterday morning ate breakfast in our mess hall, walked these grounds, and flew into combat from which they did not return. His voice was steady but quiet, making everyone lean forward to hear. I will not tell you their sacrifice had meaning. Meaning is something each of you must find for yourselves. I will not tell you God had a plan. That's too easy an answer for too hard a question. He paused, looking across the assembled faces: pilots, bombardiers, navigators, gunners, ground crews, administrative personnel. What I will tell you is this: they were here, they lived, they mattered. Whether they died instantly or suffered, whether they're prisoners now in Germany or at the bottom of the North Sea, they were real people, with names and histories and futures that will never arrive. We honor them not by pretending their deaths were glorious, but by acknowledging that their deaths were losses, to their families, to their friends, to this group, and to the world that will never know what they might have become.
O'Malley began reading names. Not all 170, that would take hours, but a selection, each name representing 10 men, each name standing for all who hadn't returned. First Lieutenant William R. Reynolds, pilot, aircraft Liberty Bell, Seattle, Washington. Staff Sergeant Thomas J. McCarthy, ball turret gunner, aircraft Battling Betty, Boston, Massachusetts. Technical Sergeant Robert L. Morrison, radio operator, aircraft Oklahoma Okie, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The names continued, each followed by a long moment of silence. Some men in the congregation wept openly. Others maintained rigid composure, their faces carved from stone, emotion locked behind defenses that would crack later in private moments. After the names, O'Malley invited anyone who wished to speak to come forward. For 30 seconds, nobody moved. Then, Staff Sergeant William Harris, a waist gunner from Just a Snap-in, stood and walked to the front. His voice shook as he spoke. I want to talk about Lieutenant David Brenner, our navigator. He was 22 years old. He was killed yesterday when a cannon shell exploded in our cockpit. Before he died, before he even knew he was dying, he gave our pilot the heading for home. His last words were coordinates, 270 degrees, 180 miles. He died doing his job. That's all. That's everything.
Harris returned to his seat, and others followed. A pilot spoke about his co-pilot who had stayed at the controls of a burning aircraft long enough for the crew to bail out before riding it down. A ground crew chief spoke about the bomber crew that always thanked him by name, treating him as an equal rather than a subordinate. A cook spoke about a gunner who always requested extra potatoes and had promised to take him fishing after the war. The stories accumulated, creating a collective memory that transformed statistics into individuals, numbers into names, losses into people who had existed and mattered. At 15:15 hours, O'Malley concluded the service with a prayer that asked for nothing, no divine intervention, no comfort, no meaning. Instead, he simply acknowledged what had happened and what remained. For those who died, we pray they knew no fear at the end. For those who survived, we pray for strength to carry this memory. For those yet to fly, we pray for wisdom and courage. And for all of us, we pray for the day when these prayers will no longer be necessary. Amen. The assembly filed out in silence, emerging from the chapel into afternoon sunshine that seemed wrong somehow, too bright, too cheerful, indifferent to human loss. Men dispersed across the base, returning to barracks, to maintenance hangars, to administrative offices. The routines of military life reasserted themselves because routines provided structure, and structure prevented complete psychological collapse. Work was therapy. Duty was purpose. The daily rhythms of a bomber base, however disrupted by loss, continued because they had to continue. At 1600 hours, a formation of B-17s appeared on the horizon. Bombers returning from other bases where they'd made emergency landings, now limping home to Thorpe Abbotts. One by one they entered the landing pattern, their damaged state visible even from the ground. Memphis Belle touched down with only 3 engines running. Murder Inc. landed with her entire nose section wrapped in canvas where plexiglass should have been. Made in America taxied to her hardstand on one functioning brake, requiring ground crew intervention to prevent her from rolling off the taxiway.
Ground crews swarmed each returning aircraft, helping wounded crew members to ambulances, beginning preliminary damage assessments, documenting what would be required to return these bombers to flight status. The base photographer, Sergeant Peter Martinez, moved among the aircraft with his speed graphic camera, documenting damage for official records and for the intelligence analysts who would study these photographs to understand German weapons' effectiveness. His camera captured the intimate details of near death, the severed control cable held together by a single wire strand, the seat where a gunner had bled out during the flight home, the prayer card tucked into a damaged instrument panel. By 1800 hours, all returning aircraft had landed. The final count for the 100th bomb group was confirmed. 21 bombers in various states of damage, 17 aircraft lost. The mathematics were brutal. In a single mission, they'd been reduced from full strength to barely 1/3 operational capability. It would be weeks before they could participate in another maximum effort mission, months before their losses were fully replaced, if they were replaced. The bomber production lines in Seattle, Wichita, and Long Beach could build aircraft. Replacing trained crews took longer. The evening meal was served at 1900 hours. Attendance had improved from breakfast. Men needed to eat, and the mess hall provided community of a sort, but the atmosphere remained subdued. Conversations were muted, laughter non-existent. The BBC news broadcast played on the mess hall radio, the announcers clipped British accent, reporting on the bombing raid. American flying fortresses struck the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt yesterday in a major daylight raid. Air Ministry sources confirmed the targets sustained significant damage. Some losses were sustained, but all objectives were achieved. The sanitized language, "some losses were sustained," drew bitter laughs from those who knew the reality behind the euphemism. After dinner, Rosenthal walked to the flight line and stood before the empty hardstand where Liberty Bell had been parked yesterday morning. The concrete pad was empty now, except for oil stains and tire marks. The aircraft name was still painted on the parking spot, standard procedure to help ground crews identify which bomber belonged where. He stared at the painted letters, trying to remember the faces of Liberty Bell's crew, realizing with horror that he couldn't clearly recall most of them. They'd been acquaintances, not close friends. He'd seen them at briefings in the mess hall around the base. Now they were gone, and his memory of them was already fading into generic impressions rather than specific individuals. Lieutenant MacDonald joined him after a few minutes, his bandaged shoulder making his flight jacket hang awkwardly. The two men stood side by side, not speaking, watching the sunset over the airfield. Finally, MacDonald broke the silence. "I keep thinking we should feel something more. Relief that we made it, grief for the ones who didn't, anger at the people who sent us, but I don't feel anything, just empty." Rosenthal nodded slowly. "I think empty is all we've got right now. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all anyone should expect."
October 16th, 1943, Washington, D.C. In a windowless conference room 3 levels below the Pentagon, senior officers of the Army Air Forces gathered to assess the Schweinfurt raid and its implications for strategic bombing doctrine. The room's walls were covered with maps of Europe, target photographs, and statistical charts tracking bomber losses, sortie rates, and industrial damage assessments. General Henry Arnold sat at the head of the table, his jaw set in an expression that his staff had learned to recognize as barely controlled anger. Before him lay casualty reports, intelligence summaries, and preliminary analyses that all pointed to the same inescapable conclusion. The doctrine upon which America's daylight bombing campaign had been built was fundamentally flawed.
Major General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, stood before the assembled officers and delivered his assessment with clinical precision. Gentlemen, on October 14th, we dispatched 291 B-17 flying fortresses against the ball-bearing complex at Schweinfurt. 60 bombers were destroyed over enemy territory. 5 crashed attempting to return to England. 12 more sustained damage, rendering them unrepairable. Total aircraft losses 77, representing 26.5% of the attacking force. He paused, allowing the number to register. Additionally, 122 aircraft returned with battle damage, requiring extensive repair, averaging 14 days per aircraft out of operational status. Only 33 bombers, 11.3%, returned without damage. The human cost was equally devastating. Of the 2,900 crew members who participated in the mission, approximately 650 are missing, killed in action, captured, or lost over the North Sea. An additional 47 were wounded seriously enough to require hospitalization. That's a 24% casualty rate from a single mission. Ika's voice remained steady, but his hands gripped the podium with white-knuckled intensity. At this attrition rate, we would exhaust our entire combat strength in 8 weeks. The mission, while tactically successful in damaging the target, has proven strategically unsustainable. The room erupted in heated discussion. Some officers argued that the high losses were an anomaly, the result of unusually effective German defences at Schweinfurt. Others maintained that the mission had proven the necessity of long-range fighter escorts, a position that had been debated and largely dismissed during the strategic bombing campaign's planning phase. The pre-war doctrine had insisted that heavily armed bomber formations could defend themselves through massed firepower. Black Thursday had demolished that theory with brutal efficiency. Arnold silenced the discussion with a raised hand. The debate is over. Effective immediately, all deep penetration missions beyond the range of fighter escort are suspended until long-range fighters become available in sufficient numbers. He looked around the table, meeting each officer's eyes. The P-51 Mustang production is being accelerated. I've been assured we'll have operational squadrons by February 1944. Until then, the 8th Air Force will focus on targets within P-47 range and continue training new crews to replace our losses. The decision was made. The cost had been calculated. 650 men had paid for a lesson that would reshape the air war over Europe. Across England, similar assessments were taking place at every level of command. At Thorpe Abbotts, Colonel Kelly received official notification that the 100th Bomb Group was temporarily redesignated as Limited Operational Status, pending crew and aircraft replacements. New bombers were already in transit from the United States, but new crews would take weeks to arrive and integrate into the group's operations. The veteran crews who had survived Black Thursday would carry the burden of maintaining operations during this rebuilding period, flying more missions with less rest between them. The intelligence analysis of the Schweinfurt raid's effectiveness arrived on October 20th. Despite the catastrophic losses, the bombing had achieved its primary objective. Approximately 40% of Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production capacity had been destroyed or damaged. German industry would require months to restore full production, and the attack had forced dispersal of manufacturing facilities, reducing efficiency and consuming resources that could have been directed elsewhere. From a purely strategic perspective, the raid was successful. Whether that success justified 650 casualties remained a question that would be debated by historians for decades. For the men who had flown the mission, strategic analysis was irrelevant. They had survived or they hadn't. Their friends had come home or hadn't. The mission had happened, and they would carry it with them for whatever remained of their lives. Staff Sergeant Johnson completed his tour of duty in April 1944, flying a total of 26 combat missions. He returned to Indiana, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and worked 40 years as a machinist. He never spoke about the war except once, in 1987, when his grandson asked him about his service.
Johnson's response was brief. "I was a ball turret gunner on B-17s. We flew missions over Germany. Most of us survived. That's all there is to tell." Lieutenant Rosenthal continued flying combat missions until May 1945, completing 52 missions, well beyond the required 25, before the war in Europe ended. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for actions during a raid on Berlin in March 1944, when he maintained formation despite having 2 engines shot out and brought his wounded crew safely home. After the war, he practiced law in Brooklyn, rarely discussing his combat experience except with other veterans who understood without needing explanation. He attended 100 bomb group reunions until his death in 2007, maintaining friendships with men who had shared something that couldn't be shared with anyone else. The lessons of Black Thursday were written in official reports, tactical bulletins, and training manuals. New crews arriving in England in late 1943 and early 1944 studied the mission as a cautionary example of what happened when bombers penetrated too deeply without escort. The arrival of P-51 Mustang fighters in early 1944 transformed the air war. Long-range escorts could now accompany bombers to Berlin and back, engaging German fighters throughout the mission profile. The loss rate that had been catastrophic in October 1943 became manageable by summer 1944. The strategic bombing campaign continued, growing in intensity and effectiveness, ultimately contributing to Germany's industrial collapse. By war's end, the 8th Air Force had lost 4,754 bombers in combat and suffered 26,000 killed in action, making it one of the highest casualty rates of any American military organization during World War II. The men who flew those missions, average age 22, faced statistical odds that were worse than infantry soldiers during the worst battles of the Western Front. Each crew member needed to complete 25 missions to finish their tour. In late 1943, the average crew completed 6 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Those who survived did so through a combination of skill, teamwork, and luck that defied statistical probability. Black Thursday remained the single deadliest day for the 8th Air Force until the Nuremberg raid of March 30, 1944, which cost 106 bombers and exceeded even Schweinfurt's casualty rates. But Schweinfurt held a unique place in 8th Air Force history because it forced a fundamental reassessment of strategic doctrine and proved that courage and firepower alone could not overcome a determined, well-equipped enemy. The men who flew that mission paid in blood for a lesson that saved countless lives in subsequent operations. Whether that exchange was worth the cost remained a question without satisfactory answer. At Thorpe Abbotts airfield today, a memorial stands near the site of the old operations building. It lists the names of the 100 bomb group who didn't return from Schweinfurt. The names are carved in granite, arranged alphabetically without regard to rank or position. Pilots listed beside gunners, officers beside enlisted men, all equal in death as they had been equal in the air. Visitors can stand before that memorial and read the names, but the names alone cannot convey what those men experienced on October 14, 1943, or why their mission matters in the broader history of World War II. The terrifying side of B-17 flying fortress crews wasn't the mechanical failures or the enemy weapons or the extreme conditions at 25,000 feet, though all those things were genuinely terrifying. The real terror was simpler and more profound. The knowledge that survival often had nothing to do with skill or courage, that death could arrive randomly and instantly, that the men beside you could be alive one moment and simply gone the next, and that this cycle of violence and loss would continue day after day until the war ended or you were killed or captured or completed enough missions to go home. That knowledge, that constant awareness of mortality and randomness, was the psychological burden every crew member carried. Some managed it better than others, but all carried it. Black Thursday demonstrated that terror and also demonstrated something else, that ordinary men, when placed in extraordinary circumstances, are capable of extraordinary courage. The crews who flew to Schweinfurt knew the mission was dangerous. After the first hour over Germany, they knew it was catastrophic. Yet they continued, completing their bomb runs, maintaining formation discipline, helping damaged aircraft, and fighting their way back to England. That combination of fear and duty, terror and courage, is what defined the B-17 crews and what made their service significant. They were not heroes without fear. They were men who were terrified and flew anyway.